Warmly welcome to you, Mick Wilson, head of Academy Valand and also an artist who will share with us thoughts about culture in relation to culture and art in relation to society, more or less. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organisers for this generous invitation to come and speak to you. I've been probably a little bit too ambitious in what I'm trying to squeeze into 25 minutes, so I may not get to finish all of this, but at least we'll get to start. So what I'm trying to do is take these 4 steps. I'm going to start with the proposition that art is a space for critical free thinking. And then I want to reverse and take a second step and say connecting art and freedom is often a way to stop people from thinking. And then the third step I want to make is to make a connection between this word imagination, which has been very important this morning, and other ways in which the idea of art might connect to what I'm calling the political imagination. And then finally, if time allows, I would like to give a footnote on this question of shock entrepreneurship, the way in which artists and others can gain celebrity and public visibility through courting controversy. And I want to point to that as a form of mass stupefaction. But let's see if we get there. So to begin with, art as a space for critical free thinking. I have 3 simple examples. The first one, Russian constructivism. So I see this as one example of where artistic practice has been a space of critical thinking that breaks beyond the established horizon, what people are already given to think. So a number of artists who were working in experimental ways in the 1910s in Moscow and Petersburg, largely outside of the state and sponsored by the new wealth of the railway tycoons or else independently wealthy artists. After the revolution, these artists aligned themselves with the Bolsheviks. They said, our revolution in art is your revolution in politics. And as a consequence, they entered into the apparatus of the Bolshevik state. They became civil servants, working to try and develop the cultural policy for the new Bolshevik state. And in the process of doing that, don't worry if you can't read the text, in the process of doing that, they tried to define the language they were using. They say, what is art for the people's state? What is art in service of the people? And they rejected the idea of aesthetics, fine art, the genius artist. They said that's a whole load of bourgeois nonsense and we'll have nothing to do with it anymore. We're interested in constructing the real new society. This image on the screen is part of the archive of the Department of Education, or the Commissariat of Enlightenment of the Bolshevik state. In the archive of the Commissariat are these sets of drawings where artists presented drawings to illustrate different concepts, construction, composition, in the process of arguing about the meaning of terms in a bureaucratic institutional setting. Artists abandoned the idea of fine art and the genius and so forth, and they entered into the idea that the function of what used to be art in the new Soviet era would be to build the material culture of the society. So they invented a notion of kind of socially engaged industrial design, some idea of building the fabric of the lived world. I point to this as an example of real independent critical thinking, where the thinking of artists actually thinks to undo the inherited set of ideas they've been given to define themselves as artists, and they end up with a radically different idea of their role and function. So in this funny example, I see art as a space of free thinking that's capable of thinking its own undoing. I jump forward to the 1970s for a second example, and this I take from the American artist Mary Kelly and a piece called Postpartum Document. And in response to images of maternity, of motherhood that were circulating in the mass media that kind of reproduced this kind of idyllic vision, feminist critics were trying to think through the conditions of what they called reproductive labor, the unpaid labor that is fundamental and essential to maintaining society. And Mary Kelly's art practice was an intervention into this debate. And in her intervention to this debate, among other things, she exhibited a set of the bits and pieces that form the material encounter between the mother and the child. So here we have the dirty nappy. And Kelly reflects on this process of nurturing, putting food into the body, and the only evidence of your success or failure in this process is the baby's growth and what comes out of the body. And she puts this on display, but she also weaves it into a number of other discourses, including a psychoanalytic discourse reflecting on the nature of femininity and the nature of motherhood. And she introduces a new idea, an idea that was controversial for Freudian psychoanalysis and controversial for feminism. Her idea was that for the female subject, the child functions as a fetish. And up until then, both feminists and Freudians would agree on few things, but they would agree that the female subject did not produce a fetish. So what I'm pointing to here is the way in which artistic practice within the context of a feminist political project becomes a space where the artist arrives at a proposition that is also controversial within the feminist political project. This was not a popular idea when it was surfaced first. And of course, the show secured a certain amount of notoriety because of the dirty nappies, but we may put that as a footnote. The third example I give you as art as a space of free thinking is this project by the Van Abbe Museum in 2010-11 to exhibit a Picasso painting in Ramallah in Palestine. And this project centered around this painting, and here it is finally on display in the Art Academy in Ramallah. This project revealed the way in which the Israeli state apparatus worked to disavow any kind of sense within an international community of Palestine as a space of contemporary artistic interest, consumption, and production. So here, a very, very kind of traditional piece of modern art from the 1940s circulates as an example of the way in which art signals the presence of a modern, sophisticated, complex society. So art as having a symbolic value in its own right for signaling the contemporaneity, the up-to-dateness, the sophistication, the modernity. And the idea that the Palestinians are modern and up-to-date and part of the contemporary world is not a proposition that the Israeli state apparatus was happy to have spread within the international media. So in these three examples, I see art in different ways operating as a space for free thinking. But the free thinking brings with it a lot of complications. Part of what it brings with it is complexity and a challenge to established values, including the values of art itself. What I want to do now in the second step is propose that connecting art and freedom can be a way to stop people from thinking. Now, this is a very famous example of mid-20th century abstract American painting. This is Jackson Pollock, and is a spread from the famous journal magazine Life. And in this spread, it presents Pollock and says, is he the greatest living American painter? And in asking this question, it also puts forward a whole set of ideas about Americanness, about the free, spontaneous individual genius, about the not following rules. He gets the paint, he puts the canvas on the ground, he doesn't paint on the wall, he's not interested in making pictures of things. He's an outpouring of his soul splashed with the paint across the surface of the canvas. So these kinds of ideas about art as the space of individual expression became very powerful ideas in the middle of the 20th century, and they were co-opted by people like Dwight Eisenhower, not really a fan of modern art, but here he claims, our aim in the Cold War is not conquering of territory or subjugation by force. Our aim is more subtle. We are trying to get the world by peaceful means to believe the truth. The truth is that Americans want a world at peace, a world in which all people shall have opportunity for maximum individual development. The means we shall employ to spread this truth are often called psychological. Don't worry about that word, he says. It sounds like a $5 word, but it's okay, we can use it. At the same time, in 1952, Alfred Bard, the director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York and a champion of modern art in North America, writes an article for the New York Times saying, "Is modern art communistic?" On the contrary, it is damned in Soviet Russia as it was damned in Nazi Germany, i.e., free societies deal with free art. Those Soviets and those Nazis, they were against art. We Americans, we're for the newfangled modern art, and so we invest in it. Barr's line, the modern art is non-conformity, breaking the rule, rated within a monolithic tyranny, and modern art is useless for the dictator's propaganda. But it's actually very useful for American foreign policy. And indeed, what we know from a lot of archival work, so this is not speculative conspiracy theory, this is well-documented historical scholarship over the last 40 years. Huge sums of unaccounted funds were channeled by the CIA into a campaign to culturally fight communism. This culminated in a thing called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was a massively funded framework for globally distributed festivals, art fairs, exhibitions, musical performances, etc. Art was to represent freedom, but freedom was a very nebulous concept without any context. This was pro-American freedom, freedom of the individual, with the emphasis on every man for himself. This is a sequence of images from more recent. This is a film by Adam Curtis, a British film director, and it's from a film called Bitter Lake. And there's a small passage in this film reflecting on the occupation, the military occupation of Afghanistan by American and other forces. And we see, does anybody know what this is? The Marcel Duchamp showing up on the screen. And the teacher says, I don't expect the ladies to know. An artist called Marcel Duchamp put this toilet in an art gallery. This is part of a campaign, of a cultural campaign to position we, the American occupier, we're not occupying, we're liberating. And as part of liberation, we give you modernity, we give you modern art, we give you the promise of individual freedoms of expression. So this strategy of connecting ideas of art to freedom and using that as a screen for other kinds of territorial and resource acquisition is a broad strategy. It doesn't just impact in the arts. And I just want to make this small parallel for a moment. This is an image that appeared in social media in 2012, and it became a controversy because an American soldier was hoisting a gay pride flag on a military base. A year later, this is the Department of Defense website, the US Department of Defense website, celebrating LGBT Pride Month with events worldwide, including service members at the Kandahar airfield in Afghanistan, observed the first ever lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender pride event to be in a deployed environment, i.e. in the middle of a military occupation. So this is about the way in which the co-option of a rhetoric of liberalness and freedom as part of the geopolitics of hegemony, of power, of dominance. So in this case, US dominance in the Afghan region with the mask of art equals freedom. And what that does, who's going to say we're against freedom? Who's going to say we're against art? It's a super powerful, bulletproof shield against critical thinking. It's a disabling of thinking. So the third step in this argument I'd like to take is to propose a different way of thinking the relationship between artists and a notion of the political imagination. And by the political imaginary, what I'm trying to get into is those ideas that we have about what is the horizon of the possible. What could possibly be our world? How could we possibly be together in this world? And I'm going to take a project very briefly by a colleague of mine, Kirsten Bergendahl, an artist originally from Göteborg, who lives now in Copenhagen but teaches also in the academy. And between 2010 and 2014, in the suburbs of Stockholm, in a place called Sundbyberg, probably not pronounced that way, but called Sundbyberry, and in the regions of Ur and Hallenberry, she conducted an art project. And the art project responded to the commune's urban densification scheme, which was going to take this middle class and this underclass suburban areas and increase the density of population there. But in doing so, it was also going to aggravate the segregation that's built into the town planning. Historically, social democratic urban planning always worked to try and plan separating different stratas and segments of society. People are happiest when they wake up in the morning, look out the window, and they see people who are the same as them. This was the social democratic planning idea. And this is now, in an era of post-mass migrations, we now have different stratifications along colour and class lines. And the urban densification plan was going to make this even worse. It was also going to remove certain green areas that were very important to the local residents. So Bergendahls' strategy was to conduct a parallel democratic process whereby the different residents of these areas would come together to imagine what could a new area look like. That did involve increasing populations, but involved reducing the segregation. And out of this, the way in which the local government conducts its planning, cultural planning, residential planning, transport planning, the way in which that process was organized was reconsidered, and there was an idea to try and make the processes of local government in some way learn from the experimental processes of consultation that the artist did. In this case, the artist is operating not as a celebrity constructing spectacle, but rather as a very kind of subtle, almost invisible worker moving through the fabric of this area and creating relations and creating challenges so that people's social relations become repoliticized. So people don't go, oh, well, the segregation of people in the suburbs, it's just a kind of natural phenomenon. Brown-skinned people naturally gravitate towards each other and white-skinned people gravitate towards each other. That's why it's just natural. So it denaturalizes it and say, no, this happens because of political process. And it can be made different through political process. But that political process is not a handling of citizens, it is the action of citizens. I take this as an example, and I'll just jump a little here. I take this as an example of the ways in which the artist's practice can unleash other possibilities of thinking, but not through the orchestration of shock and awe, not through slapping the bourgeoisie on the face, but through actually intervening in the minute details of everyday textures of life. I'm not saying this is the only practice we should look at. I'm saying it's a practice that we should consider. The reason I think this is important is because we have police chiefs announcing facts like this that somehow work to create a really strange mythology around what is actually the pragmatic practice of managing a city. This turns it into something of a kind of Hollywood drama rather than turning it into a process of democratic distributed decision making. I'm going to jump to my last step, or finish this and make the last step. So what I'm proposing is that some forms of contemporary art are actually applied experiments. They're concrete, real things that happen in the world, but they're applied experiments in political imagination. And I think that that is one of the dimensions of art as a space of free thinking that we desperately need to cultivate and access more, in contrast to what I call shock entrepreneurship. And for me, it is something of a revelation, the degree to which our media here in Scandinavia are willing to play along with the tactics of shock entrepreneurship. So, shock entrepreneurship. This I define as the quest for visibility and celebrity through shock. The orchestration of controversy through the breaking of the rules, with the goal of riding the wave of controversy as a heroic figure. I'm the one who stood up and said, I'm against. They're all after me now. The institutions are out to get me. Everybody says bad things about me. It's because I stood up and I spoke truth to power. I'm a rebel. I'm a heroic figure. I'm the one who pointed at the hypocrisy of the society. And this positioning of oneself as against the establishment, against the powers, against the institution, while taking the resources and the powers of institution. So this is where middle class, highly educated, super entitled, well positioned, with access to power elites, people position themselves as the victim, the one who's been done down. This is not to say that people don't experience real threats of violence and real danger, but it is to say that their construction of this mythology of victimhood is also an orchestration that's designed to stop us from being able to think clearly. Are you for or against censorship? Do you believe in free speech? No, it's a simple question. Do you believe in free speech? There's no room for anything else. Do you believe in freedom? Are you against freedom? So this kind of reduction of our public debate to the terms of 10-year-olds arguing in the schoolyard, the reduction of complexity and the evacuation of intellectual work from our public dialogues. This is what shock entrepreneurship brings, mass stupefaction. One version of shock entrepreneurship exists in politics, and another version exists in contemporary art. And I, for one, would like to have a more interesting and nuanced conversation with people than one that is structured to achieve the fame for one or two, to remove the possibility of us attending to the fact that we live in a complex world, and to see that in a complex world of multiple worldviews, of profoundly different understandings, none of us is in a position to produce the final fundamental ground on which we encounter each other. We are always caught in a provisional encounter with each other where any absolute rule is not going to work. We need to find ways to imagine how we can be together even though we might live in fundamentally different worlds. Art can be a part of that, but it requires a wider social process of public, informed, critical, careful debate. I hope you will debate with me and challenge this proposition that I've given you. Thank you.
Ja, då ska jag presentera den här timmens andra talare. Det är Magnus Erikson som är designforskare på RISE Interactive och doktorand i rättssociologi. Och du har med din bakgrund inom både akademi, nätkonst och nätaktivism följt digitala kulturers uppgång och fall. Och ska prata lite om det. And in English, Magnus Erikson, design researcher at RISE Interactive and also doing a PhD in sociology of law. And we will now hear a presentation relating art and technology to some kind of critical approach. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm also going to talk in English here. The title of this presentation was Going Forward with Art and Technology, Learning from a Long List of Failed Experiments. And this can seem as a very bland title, and I will try to pick it apart throughout this presentation, starting with actually the word technology. Art and technology are often put together in exactly that order, in that sentence, in many different contexts, schools, festivals, artist practices, and so on. But there's a reason to be critical in several ways of this word of technology. First of all, it's putting it forth as a deterministic concept, that the technology is already done, and the artist's job is to relate to it or use the technology in some way. The technology is developed and constructed and imagined somewhere else. It also implies a singular historical development, that we're able to talk about the state of technology with a big T as something that is often seen as more advanced today than the state of technology yesterday, and sometimes accelerating fast and sometimes stagnating, this growth of technology. Something that is often taken from the model of the exponential growth of the capacities of microprocessors in computers. Because the development and dissemination of technology, actual technology that we live with and use, is not a linear process. Sometimes older ideas become realized in the wrong order, so that what is perceived as new is actually based on an older idea. Old technologies are sometimes revived in new context, and infrastructural development can go in both directions. So the actual technology we live with does not follow this linear process. But if you go today to any art and technology festival or event, you will mostly see that this word is interpreted as digital information technology and computational media. Sometimes with a bit of biotechnology thrown in, which is sometimes heralded as the next technological revolution. But precisely because biotechnology is about becoming a computational media and treating bodies as programmed machines. So what I will argue is that throughout several strategies, this engagement between art and technology has failed to engage it in a critical way, and precisely because technology has been conceptualized in this way. And I myself, I'm not an artist, but I have been doing some amateur engagement in art and technology as part of two former collectives, one called Piratbyrån and one called FatLab. So I want to talk about three different kinds of entanglements between art and technology. The first is seeing technology as a tool that provides certain kind of artistic expressions, and that can be explored in which ways it can create artistic expressions. So the question here is, what can be done with this new technology or old technology? I would say the majority of engagements that claim to be about art and technology end up here. Artists use various kinds of technological tools to produce art or distribute art, or use various technological tools as networking and platforms tools. This can be more or less critical or celebratory of the artistic possibilities of new media. And characteristic of this is that the technology is created somewhere else and then tweaked by the artist in ways that the manufacturer of the technology did not consider or think about. The other one is technology as a system, where technology is investigated as a system that puts certain limitations or possibilities on the way we can act. And the question here is more to ask, how does this thing work? What are the internal operations of this thing, and how can we explore that and reveal that and provoke that in certain ways? And the final one is technology as environment. In other words, we live in a technological culture. It affects it's not only something we can look at a distance, it has consumed us all, and our subjectivities and our way of thinking is shaped by the technological culture we live in. And the question then is more about, how does it feel? How does it feel to live in this technological environment? So I will exemplify this with 3 artworks that I've been involved in, and it might not be the best artworks. Some of them are a bit old, but they illustrate the point. So the first one was part of an exhibition called Who Makes and Owns Your Work, where a collective I was part of called Piratbyrån was invited to do an artwork and take part in some discussions about art in the digital context, and what happens with digital work and the ability to copy and download artworks from the internet. This was a quite simple work. It was a computer that ran a script that took images from the internet, from Google Images, and then displayed them in kind of a collage form with some effects on, as you can see here. So this is a random picture taken from the internet. A quite simple artwork technically and artistically, and it basically just explored how can we use this abundance of images online. So more asking that question. In terms of what the effect was of exploring these new possibilities, they were quite grave. There was a lawyer at Konstnärsnämnden who didn't like that this artwork of stolen images was part of this exhibition and wanted to remove the logo of Piratbyrån from next to Konstnärsnämnden in the program. This was solved by taking all the programs printed and taking a red sticker and putting on top of the logo. So you had to look under it to see what it was. So yeah, in terms of sort of black and white positions and shutting down discussion, this was, could say, one. The other one, which would be example of sort of examining how technology works, would be this project by FatLab, which stood actually for free art and technology, so fell into the trap of art and technology, which was a project at Transmediale in Berlin called Fuck Google. It was a series of projects, but one of them was about building this fake cardboard version of the Google Street View car. And at the time, there was a controversy in Germany about privacy issues of the Google Street View car that goes around and takes pictures of everyone and then puts it on Google Maps as a service. And sort of the questions of the power of these platforms to freely take pictures and use images for their services. But there was also the opposite viewpoint of people who were really longing for their city to be put on Google Street View and was impatient of letting Google come and do this. So we wanted to explore a bit on what the power of these brands and platforms are in terms of the way they're able to act and the kind of reactions they create. And as part of it was doing sort of a performance going around in Berlin with this fake Street View car, and this is an example of sort of stopping in the middle of traffic to adjust the camera, which no one really complained because it was a Google car, and Google was there on an important mission to capture Berlin finally on Street View. And people got very excited, as you probably have seen on Street View, that there's lots of pictures of people sort of running after the car and waving to it and all kinds of things. Then we have another example here of more the third version of sort of technology's environment and exploring digital cultures. This was a project called S23M, also with Piratbyrån, which this is a later picture, but it began in 2008 when we got invited to the Manifesta Biennial in Italy, and the budget was not big enough to afford plane tickets for everyone who wanted to go, so we bought a bus instead. And so the project became basically the bus, both as sort of recording the journey down, and then the bus as an exhibited object where we lived here in the gallery space, because hotel rooms were also expensive. And this was also an example of sort of trying to understand the differences between living in a digital culture. This was a group of people who were spending a lot of time together online. and also living in a confined physical space where you sort of have to negotiate various personal relations, and also as part of it for also using analog media like cassette tapes, and thinking about what the difference between these were and the digital media of MP3s, which was then the popular format, where you have sort of an infinite selection of various forms of music that you have to make a choice of which to listen to. So those are the three strategies, and you could say that there is, in some sense, there is a decreasing level of naivety throughout these, and autonomy and sort of plasticity of art in relation to technology, wherein the first one is about using technology to expand your possibilities of expression, and the last one is more sort of you are surrounded by technology that is out of your control. And all of these strategies comes with their own risks and failings, possible failings, which you could say that they've all failed in different ways. The first one, for example, is very action-oriented and tries to take control of the technology and do something other with it than it was intended through in the beginning. But it also risks sort of becoming a promoter of these new technologies, and there's many examples of artists that have used new technologies in critical ways, and then sort of 6 years later, a company launches the same feature but a bit watered down in a commercial system, which, for example, happened with this the recent viral app, which is Google Arts and Culture, where you can take a selfie of yourself, and their algorithm matches you with the face of a portrait from art history that looks like you. And it's very funny to see, oh, I look like someone in an old Rembrandt. Or sometimes you're not found in art history, and you can wonder why that is. Which was something similar was done, but kind of in a manual way by an art project earlier. The second one, which is sort of critically investigating technology as a system, it can be very research-oriented and sort of critical and theoretical, but it also risks a kind of marginalization that you can critique and complain about these systems forever, but there's no real possibility of action involved in this. And the third one also risks a kind of cynical resignation towards the digital culture you live in that is similar almost to climate scientists taking a strategy of climate adoption instead of climate mitigation. That's okay, there's no way to change it anymore, let's find out how to live with it in the best way possible. There is also kind of a built-in reactivity in all of these strategies. There is somehow a market for critical art and technology that is strangely follows and is fueled by the ups and downs of the technology industries that it latches onto. Either being slightly ahead in terms of sort of an avant-garde exploring the possibilities of new technologies that only later will be realized as commercial systems. Usually following sort of in the beginning of a new technology or after a big bust of the markets when there is not so much action in the commercial space, there is possibilities for artists and others to get ahead. Or following slightly behind, sort of perpetually critically engaging with the latest technology, whether it's Facebook or Google or artificial intelligence or whatever is the latest thing. Also kind of following behind. So I wanted to end by talking about the role of failure. Because I'm not the only one now who says that, oh, the engagement within art and technology has failed. It's quite a dominant feeling now that there was a space in the early days of the web or the early 2000s when there was a possibility for alternative platforms, alternative ways of organizing through digital networks. Now we're dominated by the big platforms, and they find ever increasing and sophisticated ways of sort of steering our attention and making us addicted to their platforms. And there is also now a sort of decreased trust in the possibility of creating alternatives to these platforms, and there is also a sense that in some periods of digital culture, so for example in the early 2000s, there was kind of a balance between, on the one hand, accessibility of technology, and on the other hand, the ability to, with quite simple means, shape them and challenge the dominant paradigms without being necessarily a computer scientist. Whereas the dominant paradigm of today, which is based on large computational resources in data centers, advanced algorithm and artificial intelligence, really would make a sort of alternative version of this into a very resource and competence heavy project, which you only see some artists are capable of doing this type of thing. Like, for example, the oh, I forgot it, so I will I'll try to remember. I.L. Weissman, what's his project called? Anyway, yeah, forensic architecture that has teams of computer scientists and artists and everyone working together. So it's kind of big resources projects. But failure is also celebrated today, in particular in sort of design and entrepreneurial startup cultures. Failure is a chance to learn. It's a chance to find bugs in your system by putting out beta tests before you sort of launch it in a big sense. And in the so-called lean startup culture, which is a hot startup strategy now, they call it even not failure but pivot, which means you quickly test different applications of a technology in different markets until you see what sort of sticks and what becomes popular. But I would say also that artistic engagements with technology have often failed in another way, different from this one, which is often by setting sort of the ambitions too high, or trying to enact something that is not really realizable in this world, and sort of being a bit burned by the sun by getting too close. And this is failures that is not just sort of producing lessons that you can learn from and then tweak it and do it a little bit better the next time, but sort of running into dead ends and being left there until maybe someone else picks it up later. For example, with around the group of Piratbyrån, there was this concept of CopyMe here by E.B. CopyMe Botani, who which imagined sort of a world where a world without intellectual property, a world where the social conditions of producing art did not rely on sort of protecting it through intellectual property and patents and so on. Which was also sort of not, the world was not ready for that, in a sense. And we see this not only in art. For example, there is a early computer scientist called Ted Nelson, which really was the one who imagined hypertext from the beginning in his book Computer Lib, and also in his book Dream Machine was the first to sort of imagine that the computer would be a media machine, not just a calculating machine. He has tried since the 1970s to launch a program called Xanadu, which is the sketch of this here, which is about sort of, he wanted another way of reading and writing and referring with computers that was not based on the desktop metaphor that we eventually got. Today he's over 80 years old, and he has a YouTube channel where he does lectures with titles such as Computers for Cynics. So there is also a risk with this kind of extreme failure that it can become very tragic, and this idea of sort of the failed hero who flew too close to the sun, and it can be a bit pathetic as well. This can also materialize in other ways. For example, in also not only trying to create different kinds of technologies, but destroy technologies. So this is an artwork that was presented at the Transmediale Festival last year, I think, which is Johannes Paul Ratter, who went into an Apple store with jewelry made of a metal called gallium, which melts at body temperature. It's completely harmless to humans, but that's the effect. What happens if you would drop it on a digital device? It reacts. I don't know exactly the chemistry behind it. So it was kind of a performance of going in and heating up this metal and then letting it drop on all of these Apple computers in the Apple store in Kurfürstendamm in Berlin. Which is also something that obviously is not really a valid strategy, but it's something different also than sort of this digital detox strategies that is very sort of popular in Silicon Valley now. Sort of how do we balance both being on Facebook and then taking breaks in the weekends and go out for walks in the sun. So yeah, thanks.
So, thank you, Magnus. Thank you, Mick. So now we have a few minutes for a few questions to each and to both of you. So let's enter the stage, please. You can sit over there. Thank you very much. Very interesting perspectives, both of you, and important. And I'll start with a question for you, Magnus, since you had the latest presentation. And you told me before, I'm trying to relate your presentations to some contemporary questions regarding cultural policies now in connecting to what we heard earlier today. And so Magnus, you told me before your presentation that you made a report for the Västra Götalands region, the region of Västra Götaland, when they were making their new cultural action plan. I think there's a 5-year plan about goals and means to reach the goals. And you looked at, I guess, cultural and technology aspects. And so briefly, can you tell me what was your advice to the Västra Götalands to the region of Västra Götaland regarding how to focus maybe more on art and technology, and also what do you think there are some neglected issues regarding this area that politicians should maybe address more?
I think because the title of it was nyttja tekniken, so kind of making use of technology, which I think would fall a lot in this first category of my categories. And I think apart from sort of efforts to digitize cultural heritage and stuff like that, a lot of the other things they were asking about was sort of how do we value various sort of art projects in a broad sense that wants to make use of technology, which is the direction to go and so on. And here I think I think you need to a bit demystify art using technology. It's not that we had a past time where art was not using technology and now we have it sort of. And there is nothing sort of an end in itself, I think, of art using the latest technology and technological developments, because it's just sort of what's being released on the market now. Now, for example, virtual reality is a big thing, but there was virtual reality also 20 years ago. Now there's another push for it. So I think they need to be judged on other basis than like their artistic qualities and so on. But the other thing I tried to point out was also this, that we also live in a digital culture nowadays, which means that even if you do something that is not relating at all to making use of technology in the sort of artistic expression, if you're a dancer, it's different to be a dancer now in the digital culture we have now, growing up being interested in dance than being that 20 years ago. So kind of being mindful of those things, and I'm thinking, of course, that today you have sort of you can go to YouTube and search for whatever videos and tutorials of dancing and so on. So how to kind of leverage that, but also look at the negative sides of living in this technological culture, like what is the condition of I don't know, cultural spaces to be able to be visible in sort of this economy of attention, digital platforms and stuff like that.
Yeah, when I did my presentation before, I quoted from an article in Dagens Nyheter, and there was a researcher from Borås actually interviewed in this article. She's a researcher in this field of, when it comes to cultural policies, and she was worried actually about how political parties are not so aware, seem to be not so aware of in their programs, etc., of how the consequences of living in a digital society and how it changes the conditions for the people making art and creating, well, the culture, but also in participating. And do you have like are there any particular, like if you break it down, some issues that could be addressed more, like for instance when it comes to intellectual property, or do you inform us a bit about maybe future issues that might be more important in a few years?
Yeah, more research needed. No, but it's a bit hard to say because it shifts also very fast. I mean, this is one of the for example, if you look at the conditions of journalism and news media, like a change in algorithm of Facebook, which they said they would do now, can change the conditions of them a lot. So it's hard to kind of predict something it was, for me, it was very hard to think about just the 5 years ahead. Like this was 1 or 2 years ago, so I guess it was 2020 or something like that.
You mean because everything changes so fast?
Yeah, so it's hard to say now what will be the issue then. But of course, also an issue, I guess, is to try to not be reactive to what happens in what is like I mean, it's a market, and it dries up because venture capitalists get scared and they go somewhere else. So it's very hard to also to. There are other things that can change this very, very fast.
And Mick, you spoke about very interestingly about how art, connecting art and freedom, could actually stop people from thinking. And since you are head of Akademi Valand, you are head of an educational institution. How do you structure your art institution or your like education to secure that you actually do not stop people from thinking, but encourage them to make them critical? How do you do that?
A very good question. Before I answer that, can I just pick up on the themes, because it strikes me that one of the things I think is particularly important is the political economy around the mobilization of art and technology as a thing. So if we look at, say, experiments in art and technology in the 1960s in the US, or you look at Ars Electronica in Austria in the 1980s and 1990s, you see that this is there's a very specific engine driving this. And I would actually say it's wrong to isolate the question of art and technology. I would place it also in the context of education and technology. And there's a wonderful analysis of the fact that 6 major companies went under between the 50s and the 90s in the attempt to place computers in the classroom. And so there was a paradigm which said we're going to have these things in every classroom, but many capitalist mentors failed until finally it was delivered. And I would say that if you place it in the broader context of the political economy, out of which technology, as you rightly criticize this notion of technology having its own inner logic of development, it's shaped by other processes. I think that might be a way to unpack this. But I'm a little bit cautious of the idea of failure in relation to critique, because I think that the problem with critique is that if we hold out for it, that it must deliver immediate, overwhelming social revolution or world change, we might be asking too much of what a particular moment of critique can achieve. I think the work of critique is maybe more dispersed and more, endlessly caught in some failure, but not necessarily a positive failure, a negative failure, but just understood that critique has a condition of possibility as its own undoing. So anyway.
But what did you mean? Were those 6 companies going under? Were they
Well,
were ahead of their time? No.
What I mean is that the ideological position which said the computer is the future of education, this is what must happen, that position had been worked out as a policy, both by public authorities, by OECD, those kinds of players, and it had been worked out by the private players, by the commercial interests. Even against the demonstrable failure of the industry, they still continued because their policy commitment was so strong. So what that demonstrates to us is just about the broader question of how policies emerge, how they shape, and how they continue. They're not typically based in the evidence of experience, they're based in ideology. And I think this is maybe
now
what
Spotify is calling for programming in school and stuff like that.
So if I flip it back then, to your question about, okay, how does one organize an education, any education, so as to promote critique? Well, I think one of the things that one has to do in any educational setting is you have to affirm something in terms of the student's desire or wish or want for something. And in the same moment as you affirm that, you must challenge and undo the fact that that desire has been shaped within a wider world of ideology. So we get students who come to us whose understanding of what art is has been framed in a set of ideas that come from 19th century German romantics. And so one of our tasks is both to support them to wish to continue to develop their own agency, but at the same time to try and demystify, to unpack why do they think that artists are special geniuses who stand outside the social order? Why do they think that the kind of Oedipal gesture of saying I'm not in the institution, institutions are evil, I'm an artist, I'm a free spirit? Where do these set of ideas come from? Why do they find them appealing? What might be the downside? What might be missing in these? And clearly the example of the American ideological push around individualism indicates that part of the problem with this imagery of the artist as the genius, suffering, challenging, part of the problem of that is that it basically, it creates a mystification. It disallows us from understanding the complexity of the social worlds we inhabit and the multiple things that are driving, and we can't answer the question, why is Swedish art education at third level primarily populated by middle class and upper middle class kids? We can't answer that question if we believe in genius. What we do when we say genius and stuff like that is we naturalize social stratification. We naturalize what is a social and political process. So what one does with students is one tries to both affirm their desire and in the same moment to introduce the possibility of a critique of that desire. The single biggest challenge I would suggest in dealing with contemporary students both within Sweden and elsewhere is that the education that they've received, not just in the state but in the media, has positioned them in such a degree of kind of atomized individualism. They're so disabled in terms of their ability to think collectively that actually there's missing bits of social literacy. One deals with 27-year-olds who, for me, seem to have the emotional portfolio of a 17-year-old. And this is something to do with the fact that we are not allowing them to experience failure, stress, anxiety, defeat, despair as things that are part of the normal developmental process of any organism in its environment. We have to experience those things, and I think this is a real challenge, that we have to bring in the idea that sometimes our children should cry, sometimes they should be afraid, and sometimes they should experience danger, and sometimes they should experience failure. And in those processes, they acquire the breadth of emotional portfolio that allows them to navigate the complexities of this world.
I think that was a great, some great final words. And thank you so much, Magnus, Erikson, Mick Wilson. Thank you.